Hello everyone, this is our mini development unit in between unit number 1 and unit number 2. And tonight we're going to be looking at a major event that's going to have a huge impact throughout the entire course, and that is the Industrial Revolution. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Now, before we get started with the Industrial Revolution itself, we have to look at the different sectors of the economy. And the reason we have to do that is so that we understand how the Industrial Revolution changed things, how we moved from different sectors and it moved countries forward. And so this slide is all about those different sectors of the economy. And so the thing that I want you guys to be looking for here, these are just straight definitions, so we're underlining key parts of those definitions, so listen for the emphasis here. In addition to that though, I want you to also write down some examples for each of these different sectors of the economy so we know what they are. So here we go. The primary sector, it's primary, it's number one, it's the first step in this chain. And here's our definition: the portion of the economy concerned with the direct extraction of materials from Earth's surface, generally through agriculture, so there's your example, although sometimes by mining, fishing, forestry, so we're talking about timber, cutting down trees, things like that. All right, those are all examples of the primary sector, but the key is it's the extraction of raw materials. That's our important part. The secondary sector, again, secondary, it's now number 2, second step. The portion of the economy concerned with manufacturing. Useful products through processing, transforming, and assembling raw materials. So in the first step, we took those raw materials from the earth, and in the second step, we're turning them into something else. All right, whether that is a portion of a finished good that gets shipped someplace else for additional manufacturing, or it is the finished good itself. Then we go on to our tertiary sector. Now the tertiary sector is our third sector. And in this case, it is the portion of the economy concerned with transportation, communication, and utilities, sometimes extended to the provision of all goods and services. That is our most important word when you're thinking of this, the tertiary sector, is services to people in exchange for payment. Now, here's where things can get a little bit tricky, because some sources will stop right there and just divide the economy into primary, secondary, and tertiary. That is the extraction of raw materials, the changing of those raw materials, manufacturing, processing of them, and then services. However, we can be a little bit more nuanced. We can go into greater detail, and anytime we can, we most certainly will. So, for example, we continue that with the quaternary and quinary sectors. That's your fourth and fifth stages of the economy. So the quaternary sector is the service sector industries concerned with the collection, processing, and manipulation of information, as well as capital. Examples include finance, administration, insurance, and legal services. In this case, you're not necessarily interacting with something physical, something tangible. You don't necessarily say, here is your good, I just sold it to you. In this case, now you're talking about information. That's important. Still a service though. Notice service sector industries. Same with quinary, our fifth stage. All right. Service sector industries that require a high level of specialized knowledge or technical skill. Examples include scientific research or high-level management. Now, this has been kind of tricky over the last few years for students, because how do you differentiate between these different service industries? You got tertiary, quaternary, and quinary. And so the way that I like to explain it is that tertiary, quaternary, and quinary sectors affect different amounts of people. When you think about a tertiary sector job, like being a teacher is a tertiary sector job, all right? And in the case of a teacher, they're only affecting, let's say, 150, 200 kids in a given year. Whereas someone in the quinary sector, high-level decision-making like a government official, like the President of the United States, right? They're making decisions that have huge impacts, that are going to impact hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. So we see a difference. There's kind of a hierarchy in terms of services and the services being provided and the amount of people affected by those services. Now, let's take a look at this visually. This graphic comes from our textbook, and it looks at the differences in the different sectors of the economy between MDCs and LDCs. Now, couple of things first off before we start talking about what we notice here. First off, we have to identify what MDCs and LDCs are. MDCs are more developed countries. You're going to want to go ahead and label that. Now, we'll get into a lot more of this detail in our next lecture, but for right now, MDCs are more developed countries. LDCs then, what do you think those are? Hopefully you said less developed countries, because that's exactly what we're looking at here. Now, also notice that in this particular example, all of our service sectors are combined together. So on the last side, we said tertiary, quaternary, and quinary are all different service sectors. In this case, we are combining them all together into just services, and that is the tertiary sector. So what I'm going to ask of you on this slide is identify the trends for both MDCs and LDCs when it comes to different sectors of the economy. So for example, in MDCs, what is the largest sector? It's tertiary, okay? Because we're talking in most MDCs, more than 50% of the population. Okay? In some cases, 75, 80% of the population might be working in service sector jobs. We might have very few people in manufacturing or agriculture or extraction. Right? And take a look here, the primary sector, it's very, very low in MDCs. Now contrast that in LDCs. What's the primary sector like? Significantly higher, right? And the tertiary sector, while still being the largest sector, is not nearly quite as high as it is in MDCs. And so we have to wonder why that is. And this is something that is going to lead our conversation as the entire year goes on. And so we wanted to start with this now, before we get into all of our other units, so that we can use this as the basis of understanding. Now that we've talked about the different sectors of the economy, we can actually get into the event that is the focus of this lecture, and that is the Industrial Revolution. Now, prior to the Industrial Revolution, we had what was known as the cottage industry. Now, take that term by itself, cottage industry. Where do you think manufacturing was taking place in a cottage industry? Was it happening in a factory? No, it was happening in the home. So here's our definition. Once again, we're underlining. Cottage industry, manufacturing, so we're talking about the secondary sector, based in homes rather than in a factory, commonly found prior to the Industrial Revolution. And typically, goods that were produced in the cottage industry were produced in individual homes by families who were producing these goods typically by hand. Maybe they had a small machine to help, but that was the big change of the Industrial Revolution, is the machinery, the new technology that came with this. So most of this work was done by hand. But now here comes the Industrial Revolution. Here's our definition: a series of improvements in industrial technology that transformed the process of manufacturing goods. Now, the one thing that I want to caution you about is this. The Industrial Revolution was not a light switch. And by that I mean, we didn't one day go, today we're not industrialized, let's change that. Tomorrow we're industrialized. It wasn't like that. Right? So instead, it was a series of events. It took a long time, over 100 years, to really see the course of events that were ultimately linked together and to make the big picture statements that we're about to make in this lecture. So I want you just to remember that. While we talk about it as an event, it wasn't a single day. It wasn't a single year. It was a collection of single events that together made this revolutionary. And so that's important to know. Now, the Industrial Revolution began in Northwest England in the mid to late 1700s. So we're talking about the 18th century here. Now, with that being said, let's apply a little bit of vocabulary from a previous unit. If it began in Northwest England, we can say that, what word? To suggest that this is where it originated. What's that word? A little bit of vocabulary practice, all right? And the primary industry that it affected was textiles. So we're talking about clothing and clothing manufacturing. And we started to see new kinds of technologies that really impacted the textile industry. Things like the spinning jenny, the spinning mule, the water frame, and then probably one of the most well-known inventions of the Industrial Revolution was the steam engine. You first had the Newcomen steam engine, and then later James Watt improved upon the Newcomen steam engine, and that's the one that we typically think of today, all right? But it was kind of a reciprocal process, right? There was kind of a positive feedback loop because what you had were new technologies, which then made jobs easier, which then allowed you to do a little bit more, which then sped that process up further. And so that new money that was coming in as a result of being able to produce more then led to new inventions and improving upon previous inventions. In addition to that, you also started to see new uses for old energy. For example, the water frame made it possible to power huge machines using water. In addition to that, coal, which was a site characteristic for England. If we're looking for a reason why England, why was that the hearth, a little bit of vocabulary, of the Industrial Revolution? Well, one of the site characteristics that England had was an abundance of coal, which then made it easier to burn compared to, say, wood. Right? Wood didn't burn as hot or as long as coal did, which made it a little bit easier to run some of those new machines like the steam engine. So we have an additional link for you here in case you want to go and see some of those additional inventions that were created as a result of the Industrial Revolution or are associated with the Industrial Revolution. And so just to give you a quick rundown of some of the ones that you might see in there, the Flying Shuttle by John Kay, the Spinning Jenny by James Hargreaves, the Water Frame by Richard Arkwright, the Steam Engine, again, by Thomas Newcomen, and then later James Watt, the Seed Drill by Jethro Tull. So before Jethro Tull was a rock band, they were inventing agricultural products. And if you don't get that joke, ask your mom and dad. If they don't get that joke, it's because it's not a very good joke. All right, so now let's start to look at our big picture. Let's start to look at some of the events of the Industrial Revolution, all right? Now, the Industrial Revolution was about new technology. The reality is, though, that this new technology occurred over a long period of time. Again, it started in mid to late 1700s, but it progressed into the 1800s as far as the Europe and North America is concerned. And so we started to see new innovations in technology, like we've been mentioning, as well as in medicine. And so as a result of improvements in medicine, for example, fewer people were dying. When fewer people are dying, that means that our population numbers are going to increase. Now, when our population numbers increase, that means we have to feed more people. Fewer people are dying, which means that more people are surviving, means we need to feed more people. And so some of those new technologies went to improve agricultural output, which then supported greater population numbers. And so we have kind of a progression here, as we're going to see on the next slide. Now, as far as diffusion is concerned, I want you to think, as we're going through this, what type of diffusion are we seeing here with Industrial Revolution technology and improvements? All right. So Remember that the Industrial Revolution began in northwest England, which is part of the United Kingdom, or is now part of the United Kingdom, we should say, and later spread to Europe and then to North America, specifically the United States and Canada, and then diffused later from there by the 1800s. Now, what type of diffusion does that sound like? I want you guys to make a prediction because on the next slide, we're going to look at it a little bit more closely. Now, in addition to that, we also saw some effects related to other parts of the world because as the Industrial Revolution was taking place, and as we've fully kind of integrated into this new industrial era, we saw an increase in demand, particularly for raw materials. We needed more raw materials in order to produce goods. And so that drove many Europeans to find new areas where they could harvest those raw materials. And in addition, we saw an increase in consumption because now, as you increase more goods, as you produce more goods, that's going to drive the price down. And we'll get into a discussion of supply and demand and what that does to equilibrium as far as the price is concerned. But when you flood the market with something, it's going to drive the price down. And so more and more people were demanding these goods, and people could afford them for the very first time because those prices started to come down. And so factory owners and manufacturers were making tons of money, but they wanted to be able to sell them. So they needed new markets in order to sell their goods. And ultimately, this is one contributing factor that ultimately led to colonialism. All right, the desire for raw materials and the increase for new markets in order to bring those finished goods ultimately led Europeans to colonize other parts of the planet, including Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And so we're going to look at that in much more detail in a later unit, but it's a note to mention here. So kind of put a note next to colonialism because we're going to come back to that. But it was something that is somewhat linked to the effects of the Industrial Revolution. Now, to wrap up our lecture for this evening, I want to take a look at a couple of images. So this first image is a map. So let's do what we always do when we talk about information on a map, and let's ask, what type of map are we looking at here? And at what scale are we analyzing this? So in this case, we are looking at a choropleth map because we have different classes of information based on different data. In this case, when the Industrial Revolution came to certain areas. And then our scale of analysis is going to be the national scale, the country scale, because that's where we see our divisions. So, the different classes here, let's point out a couple things. Our darkest red class is going to be the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. What alternative vocabulary word could we use for cradle of the Industrial Revolution, where it began? Because let's again practice that vocabulary, all right? In addition to that, let's reinforce, let's check your prediction on diffusion. I asked you on the last slide, what type of diffusion do you think the Industrial Revolution presented itself? Here we have a visual showing when industrial improvements came to these different countries of Europe. Now also keep in mind that we saw it go across the Atlantic to North America. So that should tell you again another type of diffusion. But looking at this, the countries that were the closest to the cradle or hearth of the Industrial Revolution were the ones that got it first, and the ones that were further away got it later. So that should tell us that this appears to show a little bit of contagious diffusion. Now, could we make a case perhaps for hierarchical diffusion given the industrial areas that you see in there? Perhaps as well. I'd say given this image, it really does look more like contagious diffusion. Now, our final slide for tonight, I want to start this off by saying this slide isn't perfect. This image isn't perfect, but it does kind of encapsulate what the Industrial Revolution was about and a lot of the changes that came about as a result of it. So let's point out a couple of things. First off, the graph that we have. This is looking at population in millions of people. So 1,000 millions would be a billion. So according to this graph, world population hit 1 billion people around 1800. And this is right around the time that the Industrial Revolution is really taking off. Yes, it began in the mid to late 1700s, but now we're really starting to see the effects of it. So let's talk about the progression here, and that's the graphic that we see there on the left. And so we talk about the improvements in agriculture. And so the improvements in agriculture, we're starting to produce more, and we need to produce more, which leads to industrialization. And this is what is typically associated with the Industrial Revolution. The improvements in industrialization, along with improvements that applied to agriculture, led to an abundance of food. More food meant that the population could grow. In addition to that, we also know that there were improvements with medicine, so fewer people were dying, which led to population growth as well. When you have more people, you can consume more. And because of technology, you can produce more. And so it kind of feeds back to itself. So the thing that I don't really like about this image is that we have a linear image, all right? That agriculture happened before industrialization, and industrialization happened before food abundance. But the reality is that they were all kind of happening at the same time. Now, yes, the second agricultural revolution was kind of taking place before the Industrial Revolution, but there were improvements associated with the Industrial Revolution that increased agricultural output. So to say that one came before the other isn't entirely accurate, given what we know about the Industrial Revolution. Now, it's important to understand that a lot of things changed as a result of this. But one of the biggest things that changed was level of development, which is where our next lecture is going to lead. And we'll get to that another day. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you in class. Goodbye.